Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is Coleman. Welcome back to the 21st Talks podcast. I don't know about you, but US politics right now are really, really hectic. We're seeing a lot of things that are completely unprecedented, and it can be scary to observe. And it can be especially scary within our current media and news cycle, in addition to what our political leaders are saying. Some guidance would be really, really helpful for a lot of people, I know myself included. So if you are a listener who is concerned about the current state of American politics, where it might be going, and what democracy is actually currently looking like, and what its future might actually have in store for us, this is the perfect episode for you to listen to. Totalitarianism is a really big threat. Bipartisanship is a really big threat. And luckily, my guest today, Professor Richard Arenberg of Brown University's Watson Institute, has a lot to say about both. He has researched bipartisanship extensively. He worked on Capitol Hill for over 34 years, and he understands the lay of the land. He understands the political landscape that we're seeing shift now, and he has metrics to actually analyze it. But thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. This episode was so much fun to record, so please do not forget to like, rate, and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to it on. We also just started our Instagram and are really trying to build a community over there of people who like talking about these interesting ideas. I think communities of people who talk about major forces going on in the world today can facilitate a sort of growth, a renaissance of conversation, which can go to explaining some really complex, difficult forces in today's world. So please, I would love to have you guys be a part of that by going over onto our Instagram and following and getting involved. But thank you guys very, very much, and I will talk to you all next week. So without any further ado, here's my episode with Professor Richard Arenberg of Brown University's Watson Institute. But thank you guys, and I'll see you next week. What are the forces, challenges, and ideas that define the 21st century? Conversations to understand the greatest figures and stories of today to create a better tomorrow. This is the 21st Talks podcast. And I think it's going. Sweet. Well, hi, Professor Arenberg. You are a politics and gov professor at Brown University, isn't that right?
That's right.
What is it like seeing this current election unfold for you? I know it must be a little bit strange, to say the absolute least.
Well, yeah, that's right. The least you can say about it is that this was an unprecedented and somewhat unconventional campaign, and obviously it's continuing to be that even now that we're post-election day.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. It's so like last week on the I'm pretty sure it was on the Brown. What is it? The Brown Daily Herald. You said that this is going to probably be one of the most consequential elections
Right.
since the Civil War. Like, can you flesh that out? Because I know, coming from my perspective, from my own political side and from my own, sort of like very liberal, artsy, university entrenched viewpoint, it can appear as a very significant moral victory. Or cacophony right now, since still,
Right.
potentially up in the air because of Supreme Court decisions. So what are some of the larger sort of procedural and other potential effects and ramifications of this election beyond just like the moral?
Well, yeah, no, I have felt consistently over the past 4 years that this was in many ways a very, well, the kind word is unusual, chaotic,
messy.
and I think in many ways this past 4 years has been corrosive. Its effect on our very democracy has been corrosive, and so I make that criticism above, beyond, and aside from partisan politics. I mean, it's not a question of whether I'm talking about a Republican or a Democrat. It's just it's based on the near authoritarian characteristics of this administration and some of the tactics that the president has used. And as a result, one of the things that I feared was that another 4 years would be further corrosion and possibly, carry the deterioration of our democracy farther than where it would be easily retrieved. Others have said that. I think we can survive 4 years. 8 years is a big question mark. So it's that sort of sentiment that I had in mind when I said it was. I certainly believe it's the most consequential election of my lifetime. I don't quite go back to the Civil War, but that was a bit of a flourish to take it back to the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. But I think arguably that's true.
I think something that strikes me a lot about bipartisanship, which is something that you spent a lot of time studying, and really, like, one of the big reasons why I was so set on having a conversation with you at this unique moment in political history for the U.S. And I mean the history of democracy overall, right? Because we're seeing tons of trends globally of democratic backsliding. In addition, the U.S. obviously the U.S. has one of the more uncouth and deranged versions of that at the moment, apart from potentially in areas where they're hunting down drug users and stuff. But nonetheless, there is this seeming byproduct of bipartisanism that I really want to ask you about, where it kind of allows us to justify our side, taking steps that are potentially anti-democratic to a certain extent. And it kind of limits our ability to actually inspect. And you see it, I think, on both sides of the political spectrum. So I would really like to ask you about that, because I know there's been critiques of, I know it goes as far back as, like, probably some of the founding some of the founding politicians in this country. But yeah, I just want to ask you how that affects people allowing their own side to do stuff that just isn't a good precedent.
Yeah, well, when I look at the hyperpartisanship that we're experiencing, my students would find this very amusing, because I'm known for, whenever I talk about polarization, hyperpartisanship, I crank my arm about like that, And the reason is because I see this as a circular, self-reinforcing force. And, it has a kind of tit for tat characteristic to it. And it's one side, one party doing to the other something that the receiving party feels aggrieved about. And the reaction is, at the very next opportunity, to give it back in kind or better. And this has created this sort of, I think, reinforcement. And I would take it back at least to 1980. A lot of people who write about this go back to Gingrich in the 90s. I think the roots are really in the Reagan Revolution of the 1980 election. Not so intensively, but I think from that point, or I could even make a case for going back to Watergate and the Vietnam War.
Oh yeah, that'd be interesting.
But I think that what you can demonstrate, certainly since the 70s, is a year by year by year widening and intensification of that gulf.
Mm.
And one of the ways that I measure that, I focus a lot on the U.S. Senate. I mean, I spent 34 years on Capitol Hill as a Senate staffer, and so I focus a lot on the Senate. I've written about the filibuster, for example, and I've written a book about congressional procedure. And one of the things that I've done is I have my own vote study measure that I began doing when I first came to the Senate staff. At that time I was working for Senator Paul Tsongas from Massachusetts. And I started keeping track of the percentage of time that other members of the Senate voted with him on roll call votes, and then rank order all of those senators based using Tsongas as kind of a liberal standard from most liberal to down to most conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've been interested in over the years, and there's nothing unique about this, and it's probably not even all that scientific, but what I'm interested in is the overlap between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republicans.
What have you been finding with that then?
Well, if you go back to when I began, which was in 1979, and don't hold me to the exact numbers because I haven't looked at it recently, but it was more than a third of the Senate that was in that overlap. So, 34 or some odd senators.
So a much larger section that can actually compromise and get things passed then.
Much greater bipartisanship in the Senate at that point. Now that has changed, as I've said before, virtually year by year by year by year. If you look at the first 10 years on average, it drops down to 25 or 26 or something like that. If you then look at the next 10 years, it drops again, and then if you look at the last 15 or 20 years, it's about 0.4 tenths of a senator, mostly because of the years that Link Chafee was in the Senate from Rhode Island. And for the last, again, don't hold me to the exact number, but the last dozen years or so, there has been no overlap whatsoever. And that gap between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican has grown wider and wider every year. So that, right now it's Susan Collins, who was just reelected, and Manchin on the Democratic side. And I've obviously I can't measure votes based on the Tsongas vote any longer since he left the Senate in '84. But then I switched to Carl Levin, who I also worked for from Michigan. And after Levin retired from the Senate, I switched it to Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. Mostly because I'm in Rhode Island. He's a pretty solid liberal vote, and he's not likely to be defeated for re-election anytime soon. And so he kind of fits my needs as a kind of permanent standard.
That makes a lot. I'm really interested in sort of how this larger problem of bipartisanship contributes to other things and other dysfunctional aspects in our country today. Whether it's elections becoming sort of community oriented, but in the worst way possible, i.e., like oh, someone's a Trumpster, so they're going to identify with being a Trump supporter, and therefore their friend groups and their they become
what's been described as tribalism.
Exactly. Yeah. That tribalistic tendency of mankind, which is kind of just like locked away in our head, is really it has a venue to really go hard right now and
Well,
really, really express itself.
well, these
That's scary.
these things are all tied in together, I think,
Absolutely.
and there are lots of elements of our political environment that are driving it.
Hmm.
Uh, things like the way we finance campaigns, the enormous amount of money in that, things like gerrymandering in the House,
Hmm.
things like the impact that various religious groups have had as they've
Hmm.
become more overtly involved in politics. Uh, there's quite a long list of factors that you can throw into that mix.
Hmm.
And they accelerate the polarization,
Mm.
but they in turn, and again, I'm going to keep cranking my arm because it is a self-reinforcing kind of process.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The more that the circumstance becomes more polarized, the more insular this kind of tribalism becomes, and
Mm.
we see its reflection in the Senate, for example, where, look, if you think of each caucus as a tribe, they have become more homogenous, more aggressive, and further away from each other over time. So that it's a very uncomfortable place for moderates to be in both parties. And I mean, Susan Collins, for example, just survived it, uh, but after a really bad scare. And
Hmm.
what we've seen by and large is a hollowing out of the middle ground.
Yes.
That
And yeah,
that
absolutely.
moderate senators are disappearing, either because they get defeated in primaries,
Hmm.
or they represent states that are more moderate in some way, and they wind up being not quite a blue enough version or a red enough version to represent that state. Sort of what happened to Chafee in Rhode Island.
Hmm.
I mentioned Chafee earlier. I mentioned White House. Well, Chafee was a candidate further to his right, ran against him in the primaries, weakening him. And then in the general election, White House made the argument. Rhode Island's a very deeply blue state.
Hmm.
White House made the argument, why do you want to have, Democrat light in the Senate when you can have the real deal? And by the way, I'll vote for Democratic leadership in the Senate, and he won't. Uh, and that's happened to a number of moderates, and they disappear. And the other thing is, a number of them have just quit. They've just
Hmm.
become uh, uh, disillusioned by what it means to be a moderate in the Senate these days. One example on each side: Olympia Snow, also former, of Maine, one of the uh, moderates in the Senate. And when she left, she cited her frustration at not being able to do the kind of negotiating across party lines that she believed was necessary for good legislating. And on the other side, on the Democratic side, we saw the same thing with Evan Bayh uh, from Indiana,
Hmm.
a very moderate Democrat who had been a very popular governor in Indiana. But after a term in the Senate, he was just frustrated by exactly what we're talking about and decided to leave.
So it sounds like there's this sort of difficulty of moderates like Olympia Snow. Um, that has been like causing them to not only lose elections but also just actively decide to leave office. I think that kind of is a very large symptom of this kind of larger death of nuance, right? Like this form of political tribalism that we currently have, this in-group out-group like sort of like idea or system of ideologies, whatever you want to call it, right? This larger political situation is driving this inclusion and then exclusion of people depending on the nuance of their belief. So therefore only the most red-blooded or like, you know, impassioned people on both sides are the ones who get amplified, right? Which only just then goes to further, like you're saying, the crank's running again, only goes further exacerbate.
And when you translate that into a legislative body,
I'd love to hear that.
You know, what you have is increasingly the inability of the two sides even to come to the table. And that is extremely, you know, talking about things that corrode democracy. You know, we've sort of hobbled along, unable to deal with the big issues that the country faces for a decade or two now.
And it hurts the American people.
But that's not sustainable forever. I mean, you know, that kind of inability to negotiate, compromise, moderate is in the end is destructive of democracy.
Can I ask you, are you nervous about where democracy is headed in our country because of this growing tide of tribalistic bipartisanism? Is it scary?
I
really light question.
That's right. You know, my first instinct is just to say yes, but I don't know. You know, I don't often think of it in terms of scariness so much. I mean, I guess I'm kind of an even keel kind of person, and an optimist at heart, and I believe in our institutions, and I think they've weathered Donald Trump pretty well. I think, you know, the constant attacks of the media, for example, the media has come through it pretty well, although, you know, that's a big part of the tribalism that I didn't mention earlier.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, we have fewer and fewer sources in the media that really follow the traditional journalistic creed of, you know, the North Star being truth or facts and reaching for that truth. I mean, that's the standard, the traditional standard of journalism. But what we see now in a lot of cases, particularly on cable TV and talk radio and a lot of other places, are news organizations that are interested in advocacy. They fashion themselves as advocates more than as neutral analysts and reporters of the news. And most of them don't make much in the way of bones about that, although they do say, they all claim to be doing, fair and reporting and even reporting and all of that sort of thing. But we know better than that. And if you're an objective person, or particularly, God forbid, an academic person, you get uncomfortable even watching some of these programs where you agree with the substance, you agree with the politics, but it's being presented in such a one-sided, non-objective way that sometimes I come away from those programs feeling really dissatisfied, kind of uncomfortable about it. And then when things do come up, when an
Mm.
issue comes up, for example, that you don't really know much about, and you want to kind of figure out for yourself, where do I stand on this? Uh, I don't know of an example of that. When it first started, something like fracking was like that.
Mm.
It just seemed like it was a unfamiliar word, and you didn't know what it was, and it sounded almost comical. But the point I'm making is when you're confronted with an issue that you really don't know much about, and you want to make up your mind about it, unless the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or someone has done an in-depth piece about it, it's really very difficult to draw out of the media anyway the information that you need,
Mm.
because you're being spun as you try to figure these things out. You're hearing one side of the argument.
Which I think that a potentially tricky part of this is, I believe Americans and people just in the 21st century as a whole are facing a lot of different forms of alienation, whether it's alienation from sense of community due to social media and the proliferation of these like forms of supposed connection that aren't itching the scratch in our brain in the same way that actual in-person connection does, isolation from production or alienation from their production, just like all these sort of things that are foundational to people cultivating a sense of lasting meaning in their life. And I would presume that
I mean,
potentially
it's the divide between humanity and technology.
exactly right, which
Yeah.
it's like I've had some global catastrophic risk. That's kind of my formal background in addition to politics and philosophy. That I've had some existential risk and global catastrophic risk people on, and they talk about that alienation a fair amount actually. So I feel like it's critical to understanding a lot of the forces in our world. But I feel like specifically for another example of the crank, just like turning out this self-reproducing system, is that I think we're alienated from so much in our lives right now that when you hear someone impassionately talking about some political agenda of theirs incredibly vehemently, right? Apart
Right.
from just the age-old sort of sophistry tendencies that people in mass are attracted to, I think nowadays that stands out especially more because it's showing a form of passion that a lot of people feel like they probably lack in a lot of their areas in life. Not them not having passion, but them having the ability to express and connect with something on that sort of deeper emotional
Yeah.
level, right? And
Well,
I think that's like a major issue,
I think it goes beyond passion. I
Mm,
mean, uh, I mean, we can absorb intense passion.
mm,
I mean, our political system can absorb that,
mhm,
can withstand that. I mean, it's really the next step. It's the demonization of the opposition. It's uh, the conviction that people on the other side of the political divide uh, uh, questioning their motives, not just questioning them, but being
mhm,
convinced that their motives are dark. They're that there are demons over there on the other side, and our political behavior, our political language, the way in which we manipulate the traditions, the mores, the rules themselves of our society reflect that.
Do
That
you
not only is it becoming more, the political debate becoming more passionate, but
mhm.
becoming increasingly hostile.
And it sounds like the of a potential mechanism of that hostility that sort of justifies it for people, because I think something that we have to keep in mind, of course, is that people have a lot of moral blind spots. You know, like we have very, very flattering images of our beliefs sometimes, and we don't highlight the contradictions, the immoralities, and like all these sort of troublesome, sort of burdensome contradictions, right? It's hard for us to accept. And oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. I was just going to say, what you're talking about, that is exactly where authoritarian governments go.
Yep, exactly.
When they're trying to consolidate their power, they go exactly there.
Because
they go to the demonization. They normally they try, they carve out subgroups or something and point at them and begin to apply labels to them that are dehumanizing, and then and then that evolves into overt action sometimes.
And I think the thing that's really tricky for me, being a relatively politically active, like young person in our country, is I have this tremendous fear of what people are capable of, especially people in large groups, right? I think history has shown us, especially as a child of the 20th and now 21st century, I think history has shown us that people, just average people, are capable of doing terrible things under the right circumstances or wrong circumstances, you know? And I think because of that, there's this like recognition that we really have to have in our politics, and in addition to most other areas in our life, that like we have to be genuinely checking ourselves, like morally, like, are these things that we're doing actually okay? And I think I see it especially a lot from many of my friends. I mean, obviously it happens on both sides to a massive extent, but just because I'm someone on the left, I have more friends on the left currently, and I see it when it comes to simplifying what the other side's actually worried about. So to speak to that totalitarianism point, is Trump has been able to tap into a genuine fear of many Americans, many working class Americans, and then amplify it in certain directions, right? He's him and his team has curated certain fears, but it's still based off of a root fear that was genuinely there and not constructed, which I believe is an aspect of our economic system. And I feel like that's something that's more unifying among people, is like most folks who support Trump or supported Biden in his last campaign, just statistically, most of those people are going to be working class people, because we have economic inequality. And that because of that, there's this common sort of experience. Oh, I'm so sorry. There's a common experience of being deprived of access to certain things because of economic standings, right? And I think that what it has come down to is how politicians, given different sidings, left or right, or what have you, then take that root experience and then twist it in a different direction. And you can't simplify that. You can't simplify the other side and be like, well, they're all just this or that. It's like, no, there's complex, genuine emotion underneath there that in part has been hijacked by community and politicians, unknowingly or knowingly, but also there's still that root emotion there, and it doesn't serve us to act like to dehumanize that side. And then, the obvious like teleology of that is what you're saying, is the demonization.
Yeah. And it's complicated. You're right. It's complicated. As you were talking about that, I think you're right about that. But the obvious addition that I would make to it is that we've had a deep and at various times almost hidden racism that has run through our culture, our politics, our country, and what this division that we're talking about now has done is it kind of tore the Band-Aid off of that and revealed, to the light, much more than had been true in recent years. The insidious, anti-African American racism that we see in our country, and as we've been talking about, what this tribalism, these divisions have done is given permission to those those who have those kinds of racist beliefs and feelings and grievances and so forth. It gives them a kind of permission slip to be much more overt about it. And then that, in turn, has been accelerated, amplified, and deepened by President Trump himself and his own kind of racist rhetoric and, the kinds of things that he has said and done over the past 4 years.
And I think especially the lack of, denouncing white supremacist groups when we saw after Charlottesville, and then now, during the first presidential debate, right? It is this, the word apocalypse, the etymology for it is to like reveal, uncover, right? So I feel like there has been this great like unveiling of American racism that to so many folks was incredibly apparent, right? Incredibly apparent.
Yes.
But I think even in sections of the Democratic Party, and the sort of more true left, if you want to go a little bit even farther left, I think because of how insular some of our left-leaning communities can be on college campuses and other places like that, there's kind of been a shift away from larger questions of racism affecting people in very, very dire ways. And until like, fairly recently, in the last few years, there was a lot of emphasis on things that were more micro expressions of that, of that racism versus the larger larger forces, at play, the larger actual system, right?
Well, I think because
sorry.
I think in broad terms, there was a kind of comfort level that was created by a lot of symbolism, that many people could sort of become more comfortable with that they knew there was still racism in our country, but that's somehow people could be more comfortable because it wasn't overt. It didn't seem to be quite so what we're now recognizing more broadly, the systematic racism. I think, for example, when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, for a lot of people, a lot of liberals on the left, there was kind of a big sigh of relief, like, well, now we finally turned the corner, a black man has been elected president of the United States. And what we learned sort of bitterly over the 8 years that followed was that that symbolism had the effect of kind of stirring up the racism beneath the surface. And then along comes a president who is more receptive to flying that flag, let's say, whether you believe he's a racist to the core or not, it's I think undeniable that he's used it as an effective political tool.
Yeah, which is a terrifying aspect. And I think to kind of shift the conversation more towards a focus and emphasis on totalitarianism, specifically in this sort of anti-democratic this democratic backsliding, right? There is this kind of assumption, which I feel like is absolutely fair to make, that democratic backsliding leads to totalitarian impulses being more able to be expressed, right? Oftentimes it's the product of that, and sometimes it is just a way to set precedent for future totalitarianism. And I think what I'm particularly worried about Trump right now is not fully what he's going to be doing until the end of his office, or the tricks and stuff he might pull between then and now, or the damage he might do. But I think it's those larger forces, that the larger things that he's been able to kind of heighten about American politics, the fears that he's been able to curate and sort of create, and more important, not even more importantly, I shouldn't say that, but equally importantly, there's this precedent now for these certain forms of democratic backsliding, which were already there, but now have come into the public eye in such visceral nature that tit for tat nature, that of bipartisanship, can probably further just exacerbate this bipartisanism, because the culture, like the lack of sort of like political respect and these sort of things that used to be more foundational in at least, I'm sure, congressional or Senate, which would lead to people working across the aisle from one another. That has been exacerbated, not just from an ideological splintering, but also a cultural shift too. It's a sense that the other guy is an immoral, jerk, which, I mean, to be fair, we are dealing with a lot of racists. Like we are dealing with some people who have very questionable moral standings. And I think that's the really tricky thing for me is how do you say, okay, there are genuinely terrible and horrible unethical beliefs on this other side, dehumanizing beliefs on the other side. But there are still some on that side, excluding the racists, of course, who are like fiscally conservative, right? It was like, how does the left actually, or how does even the Democratic Party now start getting a more unified, right, unified approach to these things? Because otherwise, I think Trumpism will continue to tear a lot of aspects of this country apart.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add, when you were talking about the precedent setting, is, I think that's right. I think that to look at it another way, Trump has illuminated the path for some future despot. Hopefully it never ever comes to that, but in one way, one of the saving graces of Donald Trump was that he just was not that effective. In many ways, he seemed to have those totalitarian instincts, and he seemed to admire the strong men around the world, and he used the tools of racism and so forth. However, there wasn't the kind of tactical brilliance that we have seen in other dictators around the world, and in being able to turn their rule into a truly totalitarian government, and so I just think that Trump just wasn't that skillful. He wasn't that. I'm not sure that he was even that bright at a certain level. There are some ways in which he certainly is, but given all of the personality characteristics that have been observed about him, and I'm not a psychologist, but they are just so blatant in many regards that it's hard not to see the way in which some of those things have hampered him in terms of effectiveness. But if you think about the extent to which he has now illuminated the path, he's shown the ways that some of these things can be accomplished within our institutions, within our politics, ways in which, if you become the president, you can ignore the Congress, and you can, a number of the things that he's tried to do, demonize the courts,
Exactly.
uh,
Yeah.
uh, blunt the intelligence community, take control over the Justice Department, all of these things that he's done, many of them in a ham-handed sort of way, could potentially be done by some future uh, uh, president who was a lot more skillful, had much more effective tools.
And I couldn't agree more. I think this is such an important point, because it's really creating a recipe for like a Caesar to come along. And luckily, I don't think that Trump, as you were saying, was quite has the tact about him, or the tactful nature to him to really take it to the full extreme, right? But I think that if a Putin arose, American Putin, and or just a charismatic populist leader, there could be serious damage, especially if it was on the right again. And I think that is particularly the nerve-wracking thing for me. And I want to understand how these precedents that have been set are currently affecting Senate races and elections. I know at Brown, do you teach a class on American campaigns and elections?
Yes.
So I think this is a perfect question to ask then, is how have these elections in the Senate and Congress overall just been affected by this push towards populism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've seen this tribalism we're talking about extend itself in a lot of ways into the electoral environment. I mean, we see well, it's early to too deeply analyze the 2020 election, but I mean, we saw a substantial victory by Joe Biden. I think, the way it turned out that the votes got counted because the mail-in ballots were so strongly for Biden, and they were counted at the end. It created this kind of artificial timeline where, all of the media and all of us watching thought, well, Trump went out ahead in all of these close states, and then the question was, would Biden catch up? And and so, well,
worst case possible for our current political bipartisan environment too. Worst case possible,
When in reality, so it was. If you did the timeline consistent with the time at which people voted, Biden would have had a huge lead in most of these places, and Trump would have closed at the end because he did better with people who voted on election day, as opposed to mail-in and early voters. But that aside, so I think it has the effect of sort of making us feel like this was a closer election than it turns out it really was.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm a little bit more comfortable about that, because before election night, I was quoted all over the place prognosticating a landslide in both the popular vote and the electoral college, and expecting a big victory for Democrats in the Senate, in the congressional elections. So we didn't see that landslide, but we saw, Biden will in the end have won the popular vote by 5 or 5.5 million votes, something on that order, which is substantial. We had an enormous turnout. He's gotten more votes than anyone in history, and his margin is greater than any margin going back quite a while. We don't elect by the popular vote, but ironically, it looks like he's going to have 306 electoral votes, which reminds us of a recently elected president named Donald Trump, who also had 306 electoral votes, and then for 4 years referred to that as a landslide. And so I guess maybe if we accept him at his word, then it's a landslide. But the point I'm coming to is Biden won pretty handily, but we didn't see that down ballot in the Senate or in the House or in state legislatures around the country. And I think what we saw was a kind of extension of the polarization that we've seen, so that even though Biden did better in some of these red states where the big contests were for the Senate, he didn't do enough better to kind of carry a Democrat to victory there. And so the Republican senators were able to survive that.
Do you see a lot of Trump's rhetoric and sort of the light that he's paving and sort of like lighting for totalitarianism and potential routes to it? So all of that is really just a shift towards populism, like a slight more acceptance for populism. And my question for you is how does that shift towards populism affect political communication? And do you think that any part of this, I mean, obviously some part of it, but to what extent do you think that the digital political landscape and how politicians are expected to communicate to their people rely on these tribalistic tendencies? And more so, I think nuance is dying in part because of the need for politicians to communicate to their political supporters and the electorate in terms of 140 characters. Like I think that it is contributing to the death of nuance, absolutely, and is incredibly scary. Again, scary is not the most academic term, but
yeah, and again here, Trump has shown the way, so that our understanding of this is in flux. We can see how effective Trump has been in using that platform, and the ways in which he's used it to magnify his voice, and also to beat down any the efforts to fact check him, for example. He's been able to use that medium really to kind of wear it down. That's part one of the way he uses it. Part two is that he uses it very effectively to redirect the focus of, to change the subject, to put it in the vernacular. So that, I mean, who would have ever thought that an effective way to escape scandals and controversy was to raise new scandals and controversy? But he's done that over and over and over again, to the extent that the traditional media, who are the prisoners of a kind of news cycle, they can't keep up with it. It's become trite to refer to it as trying to drink out of a fire hydrant, but it's an apt analogy. I mean, sometimes, really, how many times have we said, now this is really shocking, nobody's ever done this before, no president's ever been accused of this. This one is really shocking. And sometimes, the discussion of that in the media is gone by the end of the day because something new has come up within that one-day election cycle. But even if it lasted, news cycle, even if it lasted beyond that, it was soon gone, at least in a day or two, and often replaced by, things that, fires that he could ignite simply with a tweet.
And it creates a situation where we're able to, like you said, just forget what was actually occurring even last week. And I think that is incredibly frustrating because historically a single big issue, like look at Watergate, right? There were months where that was covered, if not years. And I think that the ability for journalists to dig deeply into something right now is absolutely being undercut. And as we were talking about earlier, the formal journalistic practices, which are already under fire from a lot of different forces, it makes the job even harder to really get to the truth, right? In addition to all the bipartisan sort of cited sort of political news, right? And I think that in part has been responsible for us seeing people get elected to Congress, like Taylor, is it Taylor Greene is the QAnon person who was elected? Like these sort of figures of Trumpism in the public eye in areas where that have been gerrymandered in a way that has caused just more senators to be able to get elected by these more rural areas to have disproportionate representation, and I think that moves me on to one of the really big things I really want to get to in this interview. And that's a question of effectively what can be done to not fix bipartisanship, but maybe fight the tide a little bit, and actually push back. What effective measures does changing to or does changing away from winner take all for presidential elections, would that help with it? Would trying to move away from the structural reasons for two-party, I think that might be a good solution, but I would love to ask you. And I think the last one is gerrymandering. Are these sort of three big things, do any of them have any possibility of actually helping this situation?
Yeah. Well, I'm often asked about this, and I have to admit I don't have a really satisfactory answer in the sense that I can present it and feel really sort of, feel the warmth of thinking, well, here's, I'm putting forth the solution. So there are really sort of two channels that I point to, and neither of them, as I say, is really a totally adequate answer. But the first channel is what I call baby steps. And they are things like what you pointed at. Gerrymandering is a very good example of that. That would help a great deal in the House if we were able to eliminate gerrymandering, if we were able to come to grips with that. And I had some hope in recent weeks that the Democrats were going to do better in the state legislative races around the country, and that there would be the opportunity, not that I'm praising Democrats as a whole above Republicans in saying this, but just, we've seen the lines that the Republicans drew for the last decade. And then the question, it would seem to me it was an open question whether Democrats, if they got control of the redistricting pen, whether we would see another crank of the wheel, and that all that we do is trade Republican gerrymanders for Democratic gerrymanders, or whether there would be a movement, because at least there's an element of the Democratic Party that has a kind of good government streak to it. most of the rest of the Democrats roll their eyes when those Democrats step forward. But you know, Barack Obama himself and others have, over the last, since he's left office, have put a lot of emphasis on the drawing, the redistricting process and doing away with gerrymandering. So it seemed to me there was some hope that with Republican control of more state legislatures, that we would move toward a fairer process. Wasn't a given, but it looks like that won't happen now. And so it's going to be much more difficult things. So the other thing that's happened recently is the Supreme Court has become much more overt in its intention not to interfere in partisan gerrymandering. But nonetheless, I mean, I think there are small steps. Campaign finance reform is another one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, there's another area where it's going to be very hard without a dramatic change in the Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment, both of which seem to be non-starters. We're not going to have fundamental campaign finance reform, but we could have more transparency, and that might help along the way. And then people often point to just small steps towards greater civility in our political life, and
rebuilding the sort of culture of politics.
In
DC.
From time to time, there have been efforts along those lines. They haven't really gone anywhere or been all that effective. But I'm thinking about things like, there was when I was still in the Senate, there was a movement for Democrats and Republicans for the State of the Union address, for a Democrat to sit in the audience with a Republican and vice versa. And that actually became a thing for a few years on Capitol Hill, where everybody had sort of their favorite Republican or their favorite Democrat that they would hook up with and sit together for the State of the Union. So
I had no idea that was.
Yeah, it was kind of almost a kind of silly kind of symbolism, but
I mean, hey, human connection still matters in a system that pushes against that, right? And I think that's really,
and it is those sort of things, by the way. If you look at some of the things that have accelerated polarization, I mean, when Gingrich, for example, came in as a speaker, one of the very first things he did was address the incoming freshman class of Republicans, a huge freshman class of Republicans that was coming in, and he advised them not to move their families to Washington. And the reason for that is, in his view, that if they came to Washington, they'd get co-opted by the Washington ways. So what that means on the ground, the effect of it is, when most members of Congress lived in the Washington area, Washington, Northern Virginia, or the Maryland counties around Washington, they encountered each other in the neighborhood. Your kids played on the same Little League team, or you were on the same PTA, those sorts of things. And members of Congress from each party got to know each other on a personal basis more than they do now. they'd be at barbecues together and that sort of thing. Well, the kind of demonization that we've been talking about is much harder to do when you know the person on the other side as a human being,
Absolutely.
as a
Yeah.
real person, even if you don't agree with them a lot.
Look at Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They were they were friends. They completely different ways of reading the Constitution and profoundly different ethics, but nonetheless, I totally see what you're saying here. And I think beyond the politicians now, it's something that's there's a human toll from bipartisanism. There's a cost on people's relationships, the ways that they understand themselves, and the communities that they find themselves. Families are torn apart, friendships are torn apart, and that is ultimately a cost of bipartisanship that I don't see a huge amount of people discussing overall as a effect of it.
Yeah, and we used to have much of it were just traditions.
Absolutely.
In the 40s and early 50s, of course, Sam Rayburn was the Speaker of the House for most of those years, the iconic speaker from Texas. But for the couple of times that he didn't have the gavel went to Congressman Martin, Speaker Martin from Massachusetts. And one year along the way, Rayburn was asked by some reporters, do you plan to go up to Massachusetts and campaign against Martin in the upcoming congressional election? And Rayburn looked at him and said, campaign against him? Hell, if I could vote up there, I'd vote for him.
Whoa,
could you imagine Nancy Pelosi saying that about McCarthy? I mean, it was a different world.
I've been reading some stuff about Roman history, specifically the period of transition from the Republic to the Empire, right? Which is a little bit cliche to talk about in terms of systems downfalling, crumbling, right? But I do think it's applicable in certain capacities, at least to understand what led to the destruction of a substantially less robust system than we have in the US, but still a human-made system, right? And I think it's kind of egotistical for people to not see the some of the potential similarities, right? Although absolutely differences nonetheless. But
all of these little things matter,
absolutely, and
symbolic things like the concession.
Absolutely, yeah.
Here we are, pretty much convinced this guy's never going to concede this election.
Absolutely.
That, he may go away. I mean, at least he may leave the White House, and, he may or may not even show up for the inauguration, but he's never going to concede.
And it's a symbolic thing, like you're saying.
And it's just a symbol. But it's a gesture. But, if you go back and read the concessions of various Republicans and various Democrats in recent years, they'll almost bring a tear to your eye, because what they have in common is most of them say something like, congratulations, you were my opponent. And I think it was McCain who said, you were my opponent, now you're my president. Those sorts of things, they bring a tear to your eye because they are patriotic. They are
human,
right, and they connect to our Constitution and respect for our system of government in our country.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's just been a whole array of these kinds of traditions, mores that have just gone by the boards.
Absolutely.
And also, in addition to that, a number of things that we thought were laws that turn out are only traditions.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's that sort of cross-section of the traditions that reinforce the healing mechanisms that have to happen in society. Because I think that's kind of the symbolic image of the person who lost the election conceding and thanking the other person or showing appreciation. Is it's that's how the sides, at least in theory, start healing and become unified a little bit more. So of course that's going to go away in bipartisanship. Of course that's going to go away. And I think the scary thing is all those customs you're talking about that have been eroding away, and sort of how unaware we were of how many things that make our system functional aren't actually written into law, but are just the forays and culture. The shifting of culture is one of the primary markers. Political culture is one of the primary markers of societies starting to have rapid change, right? It's when the politicians stop acting the way that they had in the past, for worse, more competitive, more tribalistic, right? That is when backstabbing gets to a head.
Yeah, and it opens us up to what we used to refer to as the big lie.
Absolutely. Which I think leads to this larger distrust of politicians, which in part leads to radicalism. And radicalism can be good and radicalism can be bad. It depends on a lot of factors, of course, but that distrust of politicians, I think, is currently thoroughly shown in the US to be true and has been growing since the 1980s and really has corresponded to this growth of bipartisanship. And I think that is ultimately where we have to check ourselves.
Well, let me, I'm just about out of time, so but let me kind of wrap up with at least one hopeful note. And that is, I think the enormous turnout, even though it was generated, in my judgment, mostly by on both sides of the ball by Donald Trump. It was the incredibly cohesive Trump base coming out. I mean, he got more than 70 million votes. He increased his vote. I mentioned earlier that Biden got more votes than any presidential candidate in history. Trump is number 2. So, he planned to increase his vote by doing a better job of mining his own base for votes, and he did that effectively. But the hopeful thing about it is just that I'm enough of a Pollyanna to believe that it's one of the most important goods in a democracy to have as many people as possible engaged in the political system, and particularly voting. And, if we could get to the point where we were 100%, we'd be a much better democracy than we are. I know Barack Obama, I remember at least one time that he even toyed a little with mandatory voting. And I'm not sure whether that's a good idea or not, but the idea behind it that to try to maximize the involvement of people, I think that's a good thing. And it's been one of the distressing things that even that has become a partisan issue, because both Democrats and Republicans seem to have decided that a bigger turnout benefits Democrats more than it benefits Republicans. Maybe that's true or not, but in any event, it has politicized efforts to make it easier to vote. But I do see this big turnout in 2020 at least as one positive factor that's come out of the election.
Well, I want to say thank you very much for coming on. This has been a really, really fun discussion and insightful. So,
I enjoyed it a lot, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the great the great questions.
You're more than welcome to come back anytime you want to talk about politics. But thank you very much,
Okay, thank
and
you.
yeah.